I'm Elisha Tucker. I'm the Director of Education for the Society of Cincinnati, and this is Dr. William Fowler. He is the former director of the Massachusetts Historical Society, where we're filming right now. And our background is a portrait of the Marquis de Lafayette, and behind us is a Phyllis Wheatley's desk, some examples of some of the artifacts that are on display here at Mass Historical. And Dr. Fowler is the Distinguished History Professor at Northeastern University, and he received his undergraduate degree from Northeastern and his PhD from Notre Dame, and is a specialist in American colonial and revolutionary history, and has published a long list of publications, and his most recent book is American Crisis, George Washington and the Dangerous 2 Years After Yorktown, 1781 to 1783. It's about a crucial and formative time in our history that is often overlooked. And one of the themes in the book that he covers is the hardships of the Continental Army, which is our topic today. So I'd like to start off with talking about some of the severe hardships that the soldiers could experience. One of them was imprisonment. And what were the usual 18th century rules of war regarding prisoners?
Well, in the 18th century, armies really didn't want to keep prisoners because they were expensive to keep. So they tried to exchange them as much as possible. But in the American Revolution, that didn't happen. Because in the American Revolution, of course, the king refused to recognize the American government, the Congress. So they wouldn't deal with the Congress. And so men who were taken prisoner were not exchanged, but held in confinement. The worst, very worst confinement was aboard prison ships, many of them in the harbor of New York, around Brooklyn. And there on those prison ships in New York, the conditions were absolutely wretched. Disease, poor food, very high mortality rate. So they were given minimal care. The Americans, too, held prisoners of war. We had captured many British soldiers. And many of those soldiers were sent to what we would call prison camps, confinement areas, one of them being near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Those soldiers were held in sort of loose confinement, shall we say. It seemed that many of them simply escaped. Many of the British prisoners that were held by the Americans in Pennsylvania were in fact German-speaking prisoners. So they could rather easily mingle with the population of Pennsylvania. But for those prisoners who were held for long periods of time, it truly was a very wretched, wretched situation.
So who paid for it? Is whoever was holding them, they were responsible for funding their supplies?
Yes, and there's all kinds of correspondence back and forth, and some of it rather curious, I think, by our standards, where we would insist that the British pay us to keep British prisoners, and then we would insist that the British would insist that we pay them to keep American prisoners, back and forth in that regard, which meant that the people who suffered in between were the prisoners. Mm-hmm. And so minimal care was given to British prisoners of the Americans and American prisoners of the British.
Would you explain the expectation of quarter and what was the controversy in the South over the denial of quarter or the perceived denial of quarter, and what were the circumstances?
Well, there really were two levels of combat, of warfare here. One, where you have regular armies in the field. That is, armies under the command of General Washington on the American side, General Howe perhaps, or Burgoyne on the other side. And in those regular armies, the niceties of war were adhered to. These officers considered themselves to be gentlemen. And so when they took prisoners, they cared for the prisoners. Not well, but they cared for the prisoners. This was the responsibility of professional military officers, of which Washington considered himself one. In the South, and in certain other parts of America as well, where the warfare was more irregular, that is to say, it was not necessarily conducted by regular armies or regular officers, by people that we would refer to today as guerrillas or partisans. There the war took on a particularly bitter turn. It was often neighbor against neighbor. And in the South and in other places, the war provided an opportunity for old grudges to reemerge. Grudges, perhaps family feuds, grudges over religion. Who knew what the grudges might be? And the war gave an excuse to wreak vengeance on your neighbors. So it could be, and was indeed, in the South where Tarleton's Quarter is referred to as butchering or mistreating prisoners. And that would happen, did happen, in areas where there was less control, less regular operations, fewer regular officers, fewer, as they would refer to themselves, as gentlemen. And so things could rapidly get out of control, where officers might not have had full control over their men, who then just took the opportunity to wreak savage activities against POWs.
Were private citizens ever expected to provide quarter to prisoners?
Oh, I see. No, prisoners were held by military officers. You, as a plantation owner, were not required to take in prisoners. Although there's a slight exception to that, and in some cases, prisoners were actually rented out. That is to say, if prisoners, for example, in prison camps in Pennsylvania, some of the German prisoners that I mentioned before, local farmers might need labor, and so they would actually rent out some of the prisoners, and the prisoners would come to work for them. So perhaps a little opportunity to make some extra cash.
So the prisoners would receive payment for their
I'm
labor?
not sure that the prisoners receive payment. It's more likely that the Continental Congress, or the authority that held the prisoners, received payment. No, I don't think that the prisoners were paid, but it was an opportunity for the prisoners to, in fact, go out and work. Not unprecedented, and this is the sort of thing that has been done with prisoners in other wars as well, that you need labor, and so the prisoners would be sent out in the previous centuries, of course, previous decades in the South and elsewhere. Prisoners in civilian prisons were rented out in chain gangs and that sort of thing. So it was a use of labor that was available.
And they wouldn't escape? It seems like
yes.
it'd be
Oh, no, they did escape. That was one of the problems, because shall we say, the guards were not always very attentive. So there's a great many prisoners who do escape. It's very interesting to look at the records, or shall we say lack of records, on this. And you can tell inferentially as you look at this that there's a huge gap here between the number of men who were taken prisoner and then the number who were exchanged, or the number who go home after the war. Clearly there was a lot of, shall we say, leakage. And these prisoners, particularly German prisoners in America, sort of just decided to stay. And they did.
You described the prison ships. We have
Yes.
a collection of letters of a prisoner that was on the New Jersey that
Right.
was that was in New York.
Right.
Would you describe more of the circumstances that would be on a prison ship and why there were prisons on ships?
Well, these prison ships were vessels that were no longer suited for service. So they would take down their masts, run them up into the mud along the bay, along Brooklyn, or in the East River somewhere. And then they would put American prisoners on board these vessels, and they would confine them down below. And they would seal the hatches in the wintertime and the summertime. And it was terrible, dreadful conditions down there. The story is told, and I think it has some accuracy, that the call in the morning when the British guards opened the hatches to allow air to come down, that the call would go down to the prisoners, "Americans, turn out, you're dead." And at that moment, the men who had died during the terrible evening, their bodies would be sent up and then buried in a very irregular fashion in the mudflats around a place called Wallabout Bay. And so then they were kept on these prison ships because, quite frankly, it was relatively safe. They were very difficult to escape, and it required a minimum number of men to guard them. If you kept prisoners ashore, it took more space and it took more guards. So if you had these wretched hulks that were just stank and dirty and leaky, filled with bilge water and rats and vermin, etc., it was a place to keep them. But the mortality rate was very, very high aboard these vessels.
Wow.
Yeah, it was certainly, of all of the events and conditions in the American Revolution, the confining of prisoners in New York, particularly in New York, aboard these hulks was really disgraceful. There were hulks elsewhere in other American ports, but not nearly to the degree that they were held here in New York.
Was that unique to the American Revolution, or was that a practice throughout the world at the time?
It was a practice, it was a convenience. That in any port, it was simply easier to keep these. They had hulks available. These were ships that were no longer useful for any other purpose. So they were there. So why not use them as prisons? And that's what they did use them for. It'd be very difficult to escape from. So yes, there was a prison hulk for a time in Newport, Rhode Island, for example. New York was the central place. But using ships as prisons was quite common.
Wow. So I'd like to talk about some of the tragedy of war that I read in David Hackett Fisher's book, Washington's Crossing, of a letter that Joseph White wrote. He said about the Battle of Trenton. He said, "My blood chilled to see such horror and distress, blood mingling together, the dying groans and the garments rolled in blood. The sight was too much to bear." Would you describe that the soldiers frequently witnessed the graphic deaths of their own friends, and would you help us understand some of the anxiety that the soldiers felt during as they participated in the Continental Army?
Warfare in the 18th century was brutal and bloody because it was at close quarters. In a more modern time period, wars are waged at distances, and so the warriors in the field often do not see the carnage that they have caused. In the 18th century, you saw the carnage that you caused. The muskets were of short range, bayonet charges, and bayonets were the principal weapon. Even cannon were close quarters. So in the midst of a battle, you could not avoid to see around you the men falling. And so the gore was quite there and quite present. And it could be clearly quite awful. Medical care was minimal. Both sides provided as much medical care as they could according to the standards of the time. But then when the battle was over, men would have to be taken to usually fairly ramshackle temporary hospitals, and there in many instances left to die. The wounds, you might not die instantly on the battlefield, but if you were seriously wounded, you might likely die in the hospital. Infection, of course, was a great cause of death. They had no way to cure infection, so gangrene, the only cure that they knew for that was to amputate a limb. No way to stop the bleeding, no way to operate, and certainly no anesthesia. So anything that they did with these men was done with full pain, unless you had some rum perhaps, but that could be rather dangerous. So it was brutal and gruesome. Since they had no real sense of sanitary conditions, that the facility itself was full of blood and gore. The notion of a clean, sterile environment was completely alien. That would be 100 years ahead from this time. And the noise, the sounds of the men, the suffering and anguish, truly quite horrible. But the point to remember, I think, about 18th century warfare is that it was so very, very real, so present in such a confined environment. If you were a soldier in battle, you could not escape it, and you saw it afterwards as well. The task of cleaning up the battlefield, as they would say, was truly awesome. And not just the men and the mangled bodies, but think too of all the animals, that all of the horses or oxen or whatever animals had been used to bring artillery, wagons, etc., etc. And they too fell to battle. And so the carnage was really quite extreme. After the battle, there was a general sense of a protocol in which you would allow the enemy to come forward and find their wounded, if indeed they could. And they would find their wounded. So both sides would give a moment of respite to allow the cleaning up. But again, the noise, the smells, the blood, the gore, all so very real, so very present that you simply could not avoid it.
Wow, that's so tragic. So bayonets were the primary weapon?
Yes. In battle, in regular battle certainly, when two armies approached one another, the principal, they would lower their muskets, and these are smooth-bore muskets. They fire a lead ball, about 1 ounce or so of lead. And the point was to fire all the muskets, the men in line, to fire together, to send forth a barrage of lead. The range of the weapons was relatively limited, 100 yards at maximum with any degree of accuracy. And so after the two sides had fired their muskets, they then would approach one another. They might have an opportunity to fire again, but these two armies, these two lines approaching at a fairly good clip, would close rather quickly, and that's when the men would use their bayonets. And most of the damage done on the battlefield was done by bayonets. And again, this terrible, terrible method of warfare. Well drilled, to be sure, these men then approached. It was the power of the impact. You can imagine two bodies of men, thousands of men, coming together at this one moment and then impacting this huge collision of bodies and the resulting battle that would then take place, and the carnage and the violence.
So what would motivate somebody to participate in the Continental Army? Was it that they believed in the cause, or that they wanted recognition and glory, or what would motivate somebody?
I think all of those things. Certainly men driven by the cause of liberty. That was certainly true of a man like Washington and the leaders of freedom and liberty of the cause of America. And then the men would enlist, perhaps for excitement. A young man, 18 or 19 years old, would see this as a moment of excitement, getting off the farm. That might be attractive. The money, well, less so. The money wasn't very good even when they could get it. So I doubt that money was a big imperative. Also, once you're in uniform or once you're with your fellow soldiers, the notion of being together, comradeship, meant a great deal. So that when you went into battle, the notion of not leaving your friends behind, the notion that you too had to stand in line of battle to avoid embarrassment, one of the greatest motivations for men in battle. In fact, the men to your left, the men to your right, and the men behind you. You are with them. They depend on you. You depend upon them. So it is truly a body of soldiers, a band of brothers.
So the Continental Army was often in want of supplies.
Yes.
Washington knew these hardships well, and in a letter to John Bannister on April 21st, 1778, from Valley Forge, he wrote, For without arrogance or the smallest deviation from truth, it may be said that no history now extant can furnish an instance of an army's suffering which such uncommon hardships as ours have done, and bearing with them the same patience and fortitude, to see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, without shoes by which their marches might be traced in the blood from their feet, and also as often without provisions as with marching through frost and snow, and at Christmas taking up their winter quarters within a day's march of the enemy, without a house or hut to cover them till they could be built, and submitting to it without a murmur is a mark of patience and obedience, which in my opinion can scarce be paralleled. So why was the Continental Army often without supplies?
There are a variety of reasons. One, of course, simply being that the supply system, logistics, as we refer to it, was fairly rudimentary. And so the simple act of gathering and delivering supplies was a significant challenge to men, to officers who had little or no experience in this. It was also true that the Continental Congress had very little money, and so even when supplies were available, farmers might be reluctant to sell them for IOUs or other kinds of instruments that would be given to the farmers for the goods. One of the sad commentaries, I think, about the suffering of the Army, and the very real suffering of the Army, is that America during the Revolution was not short of food and supplies. What was wrong here, what was the problem, was that those food and supplies did not get to the Army. And that, of course, would certainly angered people like Washington and others when they saw that food supplies, cattle, grain, etc., was available, but they couldn't get it to the soldiers because the farmers, the suppliers, were reluctant to sell it to the Congress. And so that was the problem. Not that the nation was in starvation. The nation was not in starvation, but the Army was. And it was a neglect of the Army and a rather disgraceful treatment of the Army that allowed the Army to suffer amidst, if not plenty, certainly amidst a nation that could well have supplied, was able to supply the men with what they need, but did not.
How did Washington respond, or how did he manage the lack of supplies, and how did he help try to secure supplies for the men?
Well, he would often send out foraging parties. That is, he would assign the task to a company, or perhaps even a larger number of men, and their task would be to go out and forage, that is, to gather up supplies. And they were expected to come back with supplies. So when they went out, they would take, many times taking them by force. Now sometimes, of course, you could justify it because you might be taking by force supplies from a Tory. That was okay. You could take anything you wanted from a Tory. But then there were others who perhaps were not Tories, And here you'd take their supplies, and the officer in charge of the foraging party would leave behind a promissory note or an IOU that the Congress owes you so much money. Well, good luck in getting that money. And so, again, the farmers were not eager, they were not anxious to see their chickens or cows or grain, whatever it might be, taken off by the Continental Army. The British, by the way, would do the same thing, although the British often had money. So the British might leave some gold behind, so that kind of softened it. But the Americans didn't have that grace. And so Washington, but you needed to feed the army. These men needed to be fed. They had to be fed. And so indeed, by force of arms, Washington and his other officers would take supplies from neighboring farms and settlers.
So there was a general expectation among farmers that Congress was not going to pay up.
Oh yes, there was a general expectation, and a reasonable one, I might add, that the Congress was not going to pay up. Sometimes the Congress would get money and they might pay. Washington might on occasion be happy enough to have some money, but more often than he didn't. So it would have to depend upon the full faith and credit of the Congress.
How bad was it? Would you describe the conditions in that they were often starving, or that they were hungry, or?
I think that the conditions were hungry. I don't know about starving. I think that sometimes in the distance of time, you know, we're more than 200 years away, and we read many of the records, that there may have been some level of exaggeration. Do keep in mind that when people were writing to the Congress, they were writing for their plea and an appeal. So it was not in their interest to underestimate the situation. But having said that, there's no doubt whatsoever that the Army did suffer greatly from hunger, greatly from the lack of uniforms. All of that is quite true. But I think one needs to apply a certain caution when reading some of these accounts, given the circumstances under which they were written.
You write about a memorial that was written by the General Committee of the Army of the United States to petition Congress.
Yes.
And you write that we have struggled year after year, or quoting the memorial, we have struggled year after year for redress, hoping that each year would be the last. Every time we have been disappointed. By now, the accumulation of the years of embarrassment weighed so heavily that they were unable to go further. They decried the fact that citizens murmur at the greatness of their taxes and are astonished that no part reaches the army. Our distresses are now brought to a point. We have borne all that we can bear, and the uneasiness of the soldiers for want of pay is great and dangerous. Any further experiments on their patience may have had fatal effects. So what were the grievances that the soldiers outlined for Congress?
You know, it's very interesting. Americans' attitude towards government hasn't changed very much. And on the home front during the Revolution, where the war was not present, in places like New England after 1776, people wondered, they were paying heavy taxes, or so they thought they were paying heavy taxes. Again, people always think they're paying heavy taxes. And they wondered, where is all this money going? Okay? And then they would hear grievances from the Army and wonder, well, if we're sending this tax money, why isn't it getting to the Army? And there were always questions about what the Congress was doing. It's always easy to blame a distant government for wasting your money. And so if we're sending all this money to the Congress, what is the Congress doing with it? Why isn't the Army being fed? Why are we hearing that they're not being paid? We thought we were sending taxes. So there are a number of different stories in between. The truth is not always quite clear here. But people at home did think that money was being wasted by the government. And so their argument was, you don't need more money, you just need to spend it more wisely. Have we heard that?
Very common.
Yes, have we heard that before? And in the meantime, however, it is the Army that suffers. It was also true towards the end of the war that there was some antipathy towards the Army, which seems strange, I know, but people back home wondered about these soldiers. What are they doing? Are they lazy? Are they just hanging around the camp? What is happening? And so there was an increasing reluctance as the war sort of wound down to send more money. It was simply I think, a somewhat natural attitude towards a distant government that you suspected of wasting your money. And so increasingly the states were reluctant to send money.
So how did Congress respond to the petition?
Well, Congress would respond by replying to the states, please send us more money. But keep in mind that the Congress had no power to enforce that. The government is in the latter part of the war, under the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, the Continental Congress, or the Confederation Congress, as it would now be called, had no compulsory way to get money. They would simply ask the states to send money. The states did send money. They didn't stiff the Congress completely, but they would rarely send as much as the Congress thought they required, and when they sent it, it was usually late. The Congress, in the meantime, which had, for a great part of the war, had depended upon the French for aid. Much of the gold cash that supported the revolution came from the French. Well, the French began to have the same attitude as well. You can imagine the French minister in Philadelphia watching the machinations of the Congress and the states, and watching the states being reluctant to send money to the Congress. The French minister would then ask the Congress, well, wait a minute, if the states won't send money to support the revolution, why should the French government send money? And there was this increasing sort of friction between, you have the Congress at the center here, trying to get funds from the French, who are saying, you know, we've already sent you enough money. Do we need to send you more? And the states almost echoing what the French are saying, and the Congress trying to make a case to get money from both sides, and not, frankly, having a lot of success.
And in the meantime, the army is just suffering.
In the meantime, the army is the victim. In the meantime, the army is the victim. And Washington, of course, being polite that he was, and being very respectful of civilian government, doesn't really feel that he can pound the Congress, but nonetheless he keeps saying to the Congress, you have to support me. We have to pay the army. And then you have all of these machinations going on between the French and the states, and the army still in encampment, in distress.
At the time, there were fundamental differences in Congress about the nature of the Union, and what were these differences, and how did these affect the dynamics for the treatment of the soldiers?
Right. There had been, almost from the very beginning of the revolutionary effort and the convening of the Continental Congress, at least two views, and many in between. I do not use the term parties, because party implies some kind of organization, and that didn't exist. But there were the view from some of the older revolutionaries, people like Samuel Adams, people like Patrick Henry, who saw the revolution as a revolution of states, of local government, against a highly centralized government in London. They were very much states' rights people, that power rested and should rest in its most local nature. Then there were those who saw a greater America, a more powerful union, and union is the key word here, a central government with more power than was thus given to the Congress. And here Washington certainly falls into that. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, these were people who had a vision of a greater and stronger union. Indeed, in some instances, Washington himself used the term our rising empire. So they saw more power being centralized. And so there is a collision here between these two world views. And for the most part, during the period of the revolution itself, the adherents of local government, states' rights, win. And that's one of the reasons, of course, why the Congress cannot get money, cannot have compulsory means to get money. The Articles of Confederation are an expression of local rights. 13 states, each state, one vote. No executive, simply a president elected. No compulsory means to gather taxes. So the Articles of Confederation in great measure reflected that sense of local government, power to the people, I guess is what we would say today. It is a reaction to that will lead to the summoning of a convention in 1787. And that convention, the Constitutional Convention, emerges with a form of government which is very, very much the opposite of the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution of 1787 produces a very strong central government, but that will take years to evolve and develop. and comes out of the experience of the revolution. But in the revolutionary period itself, it is very much local government, state government, and a Congress dependent upon the largesse of the states.
So the national philosophy would have benefited the Continental Army more than the local?
Yes, I think that is probably true, that had there been a stronger central government with greater financial resources, yes, that would have benefited the Army. Yes, that's probably quite true.
Were the soldiers simply suffering from the growing pains of establishing a new free government, or did the members of Congress purposefully choose to deny them their needs?
Oh, I don't think the members of the Congress purposely chose to deprive the Army of its necessary supplies. No, not at all. They wanted to do the best they could. They were simply trapped in a system that would not permit them to do that. No, I think their intentions were quite honorable. I would never have doubted that. And I don't think Washington ever doubted that either. In his correspondence with the Congress, and even in his correspondence with people outside of the Congress, he never really doubted the intention and honor and integrity of the Congress. What he saw as a failure were their actions, but their actions came from other reasons, not out of any evil intent.
This paragraph is long, but it's worth the read because it captures the desperate circumstances of the Army. And you write that most of the soldiers have been in the Army from the very beginning of the struggle. They have experienced the humiliation of defeat at New York, deprivation at Valley Forge, victory at Yorktown, as well as exhausting marches and endless days of sheer boredom, punctuated by the terror of combat. There was no emotion they had not felt. The ebb and flow of the war had carried them to all parts of America. No longer did they simply know villages and farms of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, or New York. They had been to the other colonies, now states, where citizens were finding it increasingly comfortable to call themselves Americans. They sensed that the revolution, at least the military aspect of it, was nearly over, and hence their usefulness. When they should have been celebrating and wearing garlands of victory, their overriding sentiment was not jubilation, but a gnawing sense of abandonment by Congress and country. So, at the time of pending peace, why did it create a sense of abandonment for the soldiers?
The revolution was a transforming event for the men who served in the Continental Army. Imagine what it must have been like for a country boy from Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, the Carolinas, who probably had never been more than 5 miles from home. He now joins an army which is going to take him to places, distant places, that we might think, and he might think as exotic. He saw other people, he met other people, he found that they had common interests, to begin to use the word American rather than Virginian or New Yorker, to think of themselves in a greater context, to think of themselves as part of a great cause. And I'm sure that they took great pride in that. It was a glorious, glorious moment. They grew as individuals to see this great breadth of a nation and great promise. And they did, as I indicated, they suffered tremendously, gave up a great deal. They gave up years away from their family. They gave up the peace and comfort of a home, and in some instances gave up their lives or gave up their health and well-being. So they had sacrificed so much. And then to find that the nation for which they had sacrificed so much, the nation as represented by the Congress, seems to have abandoned them. Where was their reward for this? Why weren't they being paid? Why weren't they being recognized? They did feel abandoned. They felt deeply abandoned by this. And at the end of the war, many of these men returned home feeling this sense of loss. And by the way, they didn't return home to parades. There were no great parades for these men. They came back to their farms in Brookfield, Massachusetts, or Staunton, Virginia, or wherever it was. There was no one standing in the streets to greet them. They came back to re-engage in their lives as best they could. There was no grand veteran ceremonies. It's only years later, when the Republic has succeeded, when we are a real nation, that people look back on the Revolution as that grand moment with great nostalgia. And so then, when the veterans are in their tottering years of 70 or 80 years old, they're brought out to remember the grand, glorious days of the Revolution. But those weren't the moments of 1783, 84, 85. Those were sad and lonely moments. The glory comes afterwards, not an immediate after of the war. So they did feel abandoned. They did feel that they had been left by the roadside, by the Congress and by their fellow Americans.
That's so sad.
It's very sad. And we should remember that these men that we so celebrate, and rightfully so celebrate today, were in their own lifetime not so grandly recognized.
Would you describe the soldiers desperate at the point where they were petitioning Congress and not receiving their payment?
They were desperate, yes, but men are often desperate in situations. The question is, what do you do in that desperation? How do you act it out? At whom do you strike, for example? And so while these men were desperate, they did not have leadership, and for that I think we ought to be grateful. Things could have been quite different if these desperate men had fallen under the leadership. If, for example, Henry Knox, or Washington for that matter, had decided that I'm going to lead these desperate men to achieve what is rightfully theirs, but they did not. They had faith in the Republic, which they had helped to establish. That was the principle upon which they had fought, and they would not give it up. So they didn't give in to emotion. They didn't give in to desperation. So it was a moment when they the leaders of the revolution, truly distinguished themselves.
I'd like to talk about Washington's leadership and the Newburgh meeting where he surprised the gathered officers and his attendants. So how would you describe those circumstances briefly so that we can talk about it?
The Army was in discontent. The officers hadn't been paid. The enlisted men hadn't been paid either. Everyone knew that the war was pretty much over. And so what everyone was concerned about in the Army was that they would be sent home at the end of the war without being paid. And so they wanted to do something. They wanted to force the Congress, perhaps. Well, they wanted to do something, but they didn't know what to do. A not unusual situation in an historical environment like this. You're desperate, but what do we do? And so they were gathering together, murmuring about, I don't know if they ever used the word mutiny. That's a bit extreme. But certainly they were talking about what can we as an army do. And it was at that moment that Washington emerged as the great leader. He may well have at that moment, had he been a different man of less character and integrity, he might have said, I'll take up the sword and follow me. We're going to march on Philadelphia and just teach that Congress. But that's not what he did. He respected civilian government. He respected the Republic. He went and talked to his men and persuaded them to be patient and to have faith. And he reminded them of why they had fought. They had fought for freedom and liberty and self-government, which they were now about to achieve. And what he really said to them was, don't give it all up now. Don't give it up now. Hang with me. Stay with me. We'll come through this together. And that was an essential element of leadership. He is telling them together. We will come through this together. Follow me. And they had followed him for 8 years. He had never left their side. He was a man of immense physical courage and integrity. They believed him. Indeed, they loved him. No one else in America could have led the Army as Washington had led the Army. And so they had faith in him. And the fact that the Army did not take desperate measures is almost entirely due to Washington's leadership.
He was an amazing leader.
Historians have spent a couple of centuries now trying to find the flaws in his character. We're still looking. Historians need to be cautious and probing and objective, maybe even a little bit cynical sometimes in looking at events and people. We can apply all of those standards to Washington, and he still comes out as a great, great, great man.
In that speech where he addresses the officers at Newburgh, he gives Congress a lot of credit.
Yes.
And he says, "Let me entreat you, gentlemen, on your part, not to take any measures which, viewed in the calm light of reason, will lessen the dignity and sully the glory you have hitherto maintained. Let me request you rely on the plighted faith of your country and place a full confidence in the purity and intentions of Congress." Purity and intentions of Congress.
Yes.
So was Washington giving credit, giving Congress, was it through his support of Congress that he gave legitimacy to Congress when its credibility was waning, or was it really that strong at the time?
I think there are a couple of things at work here. It's difficult to divine the mind of George Washington. Okay? But do remember, Washington had served in the House of Burgesses. Washington had been an elected representative. Washington had grown up in a colony, in a colonial America that was devoted to self-government. That's what the Revolution was all about. So he was fervently supportive of self-government, of representative government, of Republican government. And here he saw a great moment in history. Washington, like so many of the founding fathers, had a very strong historical consciousness. He understood history. He had read history. He knew about Cincinnatus. He knew about Cromwell. He knew about what had happened in the Roman republics and the Greek republics. He knew how they had fallen and failed. He saw at this moment, and he understood the moment of history, that here was perhaps one of the greatest moments in the history of man, an opportunity to create a true republic, and it was threatened. It was threatened now to collapse in the face of the Army's discontent. For his own sake, and Washington was very conscious of his own place in history, for his own sake in history and for this moment, he knew what he must do, not only for the Republic, but for himself. It is sometimes said that these men were driven by the spur of fame. Driven by the spur of fame. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted to be famous. And that indeed is part what is in Washington's character. He did not want to be remembered as the man who failed, but to be remembered as the man who succeeded. He wanted
it's human nature. Nobody wants to be remembered as the person who failed.
Precisely. And here at this moment in history, he has this opportunity to be the greatest man alive, which indeed is something that, of all people, George III later remarks about Washington, that if Washington did indeed surrender his authority to civilian government, he is the greatest man in history. And that moment, the king was right. The king was right. So Washington has this tremendous sense of place, his history, this moment. And that combined with his character, his own personal history, and his integrity, he's the perfect person for that moment. And I think we ought to be very grateful for that.
I'm grateful.
Well, I think we all should be grateful.
Will you describe how his choices during this time established the precedent of military subordination to civilian government in the United States?
Well, Washington never challenged the authority of Congress. That's not to say he didn't bridle sometimes over the authority of Congress. He, on many occasions during the war, Congress would send a committee to visit with the commander-in-chief. And he always received the committee and was always polite and engaged with the committee. He always kept the Congress informed of what he was doing or what he planned to do. This reciprocal arrangement worked very well, for the Congress respected him as well. There were mutterings on occasion. In 1777, when Washington hadn't done so well and General Gates had done very well, there were murmurings about replacing Washington, but that never came. That never came to pass. Washington always had strong support in the Congress because he did respect them. He did listen to them. The Congress was careful never to order him in any peremptory kind of way, because they would not want to have challenged the commander-in-chief in that fashion. But nonetheless, Washington was careful as well never to disobey the Congress, and that in his communications to the Congress, his letters are the perfect example of politeness and deference, which was very, very important.
Deference. So let's talk about the Society of Cincinnati,
sure.
which was a band of brothers.
Yes, indeed.
In Shakespeare's Henry V, there's a line that says, "We few, we happy few,
right.
we band of brothers.
St. Crispin's Day.
For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother."
Yes.
So the officers of the Continental Army shared the hardship of war and therefore felt a brotherhood. Why do you think they wanted to formalize it by creating an organization?
Let me first mention that when I was working on my book, and was familiar certainly with that quote from Shakespeare, I wondered, in Washington's Newburgh Address, he actually uses a portion of that speech. And I wondered if he had ever done that before. Well, in the age of digital humanities, Washington's correspondence has all been digitized, so we can search it. And I did. And it turns out that Washington did indeed use that expression or something very close to it several times during the war, which of course indicates he was well read. So this notion, this sense of band of brothers was prevalent. Oh yes, these officers, they knew their history. They knew that speech of Henry V. They had a sense of that band of brothers. Of that there is no question. And of course that becomes clear and quite apparent in the closing days of the Revolution, when in the spring of 1783, when the war is over, the preliminary peace has been announced, the army is going to disband, we're all going home. And when you think about these men, this corps of officers in particular, who have served together for 8 long years, they have been through hell together. They've had good moments too, that's no doubt of that. And now they're about to separate. They want to remember, they want to unite, they want to be together in some fashion. And so they see as a way to do that, to form this society, which will keep them together. Notice, by the way, in the true spirit of the Revolution, they form by states. Mm-hmm. We're back to the notion of states. And so the Society of the Cincinnati. They picked the name quite deliberately, of course, because again, they know their history. Mm-hmm. They know about Cincinnatus, the Roman general, who took up the sword, defeated the enemies of Rome, then put down the sword and went back to his plow. And that is their model. Very consciously they take that, very consciously. They gather under the leadership of Henry Knox and Alexander Hamilton over there in Fishkill, on the other side of the Hudson River, at the Plank House. And there they form. They gather together. They write their institutions. What is the mission of this organization and the society? And there they organize. And, of course, elect Washington. Who else? To be their first president. And they then go home to their states with this sense of this Society of the Cincinnati, which keeps and binds them together. They also form the society for a bit of lobbying. They want an organization that will continue to press the Congress in their interest for their deserved pensions for payment. Mm-hmm. So there is a political motive to this as well. The society, when it is formed in 1783, is not altogether approved of.
So why was it controversial?
Well, it is controversial because it is seen, and frankly is, elite. Here we are in the midst of a revolution, of course, and the Society of the Cincinnati, only officers, so it is the elite of the Army who gather for this. There also is something rather disturbing to many in Republican America, and that is that membership is hereditary. So you have at one and the same time an elite organization made up only of officers, and then the society will be perpetuated by the sons of these officers, grandsons, great-great-grandsons, etc. So it is seen as highly suspicious. Is this smacks of old Europe, does it? Of the peerage? Is this not what we have been fighting against? And so there's a fair degree of newspaper war which condemns the society. Washington, interestingly, accepts the position as president, no question about that, and certainly membership in the society. But he often sort of keeps a little bit of an arm's length from the society. He understands the political downside, perhaps, of too much publicity and being too closely associated with this organization. But the society does prosper. It's not a conspiracy. Okay? It doesn't try to overthrow the government in any fashion. And of course, emerges as a very important organization in terms of perpetuating the honor and the memory of the revolution, of those who have served in the revolution, of supporting commemorations, and of course, now, of course, in many great and wonderful ways, supporting education programs to support the study of the American Revolution and those events surrounded with the founding of the Republic. So the fears of some that somehow would become a sort of sinister conspiratorial organization have not been fulfilled, but rather quite the opposite. So the society was originally founded with a bit of Samuel Adams was particularly suspicious of it. Of course, Samuel Adams was suspicious of everything. Of everything and everyone, particularly Virginians, and that may have kind of turned him as well. But yeah, it was founded in some degree of controversy when it was first established there in the spring of 1783.
So did the controversy pull the band of brothers more tightly together, or was it more divisive in the way that Washington wanted to step back a little bit?
Oh, I don't think it was divisive at all. I think that these men who joined and helped form the society, their bond was so strong. I mean, think of what they had lived through together. I mean, not only a war, but the creation of a nation. I mean, a founding of a republic. It was an extraordinary moment and an extraordinary experience. No, they had lived through experiences which no generation of Americans has ever duplicated. We have been through wars, certainly we've been through wars, but nothing like the American Revolution that brought these men together. An experience unique in our history. It's difficult to imagine, being so many couple centuries removed from it, the emotion that must have been amidst these men. I think of one of the most, emotional moments at the end of the war was when Washington bid farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern. It's reported that he broke down in tears. Now, Washington was not an emotional man, but again, and that his officers standing there, of course, also broke down in tears. He's supposed to have said to them, "Gentlemen, you must come to me, I cannot come to you." And they did. And it was a terror. So all of this emotion in this grand moment. What is it not the greatest moment in our history? And so yes, they were bound together, these band of brothers, as they referred to themselves, bound together in this extraordinary moment.
It's very moving.
Oh, it is very moving. It is very, very moving.
Lastly, many of the members of the Society of Cincinnati early on were important leaders in forming the constitutional government.
Yes.
Could you talk about a few of them?
Yes. Well, certainly Alexander Hamilton was right there. Henry Knox, not at the convention, but many of the early leaders were indeed, they were inheritors of this nationalist movement. And when you think of the Society of the Cincinnati, I may be wrong in this, and I'm sure someone will correct me if I am, but in the post-war period after the Revolution, it is perhaps the only national organization. It is the only organization that brings together in any kind of regular format the leaders, the elite of America. So clearly these were, by its very nature, the members of the Cincinnati were leaders of America.
And they had the experience of viewing many colonies and being together.
Absolutely.
And had the vision of being Americans rather than
Virginians
or New Yorkers.
Take a man like Henry Knox. Okay? Here's Henry Knox, who before the war was a bookseller here in Boston. I don't know if Henry Knox ever left Boston. And then he emerges as the chief of artillery, and Knox is with Washington almost from day one to the very end of the Revolution, traveling with him everywhere. Surely Henry Knox is a man who grew physically as well as a very large man, but grew in perspective. And he's only emblematic of the other men who joined. And yes, and clearly they understand, because they've experienced firsthand, they understand the failure of weak central government. Mm-hmm. They understand the failures of the Articles of Confederation. So they are firm nationalists, which then become federalists. So they see the Constitution as the proper outcome of the Revolution, as the embodiment, as the articulation of the strong nation that they fought for and wanted. And the Constitution to them is, in a sense, the fulfillment of the Revolution. When Washington spoke earlier during the Revolution, and as others did as well, about a rising American empire, about a great nation, they see the Constitution as the framework, as the articulation for that great nation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fowler.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.